Hello, Education 2220 students. I hope everyone had a great week last week and you enjoyed your couple of days off for fall break. So, wow, we're moving right along. We're pretty much halfway through the semester. If you look here, I'm starting us off in this video looking at our calendar moving forward. There's a few things I want to talk about before we get into our Module 7. So if you look here, very important form is due, your service learning referral confirmation form. Now remember, this form is where you were supposed to contact if you've been placed, which most of us have been placed. There's a few that haven't. So I've pretty much about reached out to everyone at this point. I mean, kind of figured out where you are, what you were missing, who's been placed where. I've already had some people who have completed their 12 hours and their mentor teacher has sent me their closing documents, their evaluation and log. So if you have been placed and you have not submitted your referral confirmation form to Teams, please do that. You'll see it's due October the 23rd. Now remember that referral form has to be completed by both the administration, which is like the principal or the assistant principal, and the teacher you're placed with. That would be your mentor teacher. And then the completed form will go to Teams. And once that's submitted, you will get the green lights pretty fast. So get that submitted. Another thing I want to draw your attention to is your choice-based project. So in this course, you had a choice of three options for your work, your choice-based project. So you could do an interview. So you were interviewing a parent who had a child with special needs, or you could do a peer review article from the journal Teaching Exceptional Children, or you chose to do work-based learning where you were working with either East High School or West High School or a special event. So if you were going to choose either the interview or the peer review articles, those are due the 26th. Now, if you're completing work-based learning, many of us haven't started it yet, so just keep that in mind that that date doesn't apply to you. This date of October 26th is only going to be for the people who chose an interview or the peer-reviewed article. Also, you'll see here that this week, which I'll talk about in just a minute, this module 7 is a 2-week module because there's a lot of things that we want to cover in that section. And it's a pretty heavy section because it's all about classroom management and behavior strategies. So that will be a 2-week module. But moving past that, you're going to see that weeks of November 17th through the 30th, it's also a 2-week module, and Thanksgiving break falls in there. But more importantly, is when you are going to be doing your co-teaching presentations, which I'm going to be doing a separate video on that again, because I want to talk about a few things with you as far as presentations. And then your service learning closing documents. That means that you should have already finished your 12 hours. They'll be due by that time. And the closing documents is just going to be your evaluation from the mentor teacher and your log where you logged your hours every time you went into the classroom. So that will also need to be uh, due to me. Now, the service learning closing documents, you will not submit them. If I have emailed you that you have the green light, you will see that I gave you the address and my email address. So they could either email it to me on the address I provided, or they could mail it by, we call it snail mail. They can mail it to me that way. You do not submit it to Dropbox, okay? The only thing you're going to be submitting to Dropbox will be your written assignments. Well, that will be your journal, your service learning journal, and then your written analysis. So your service learning written analysis. Both of those make up the written assignment portion of the project. So that is due on November 30th. And then once we get back from Thanksgiving, really we only have 2 weeks left, right? Because at that point we're doing like class wrap up activities, all makeup work, course feedback, our post test, and then the week following that will be finals week. So we're dwindling down to the semester's almost going to be coming to an end. So I just wanted to kind of let you see the forefront of what you have the next few weeks to look forward to and what we're working on. Um, the other thing I wanted to mention too is if you are struggling like with your co-teaching presentation because you've never done a lesson plan, or if you are having trouble with anything with service learning or you don't know what to do, just please reach out because I'm here to support you and help you. I know it can be a little bit difficult sometimes when you're new to these things. So, okay, so let's go ahead and jump into what you're going to be working on this week. This week, as I mentioned, is a 2 week module that we're starting. So this will go for 2 weeks, and we're going to be learning all about classroom management and behavior strategies and what that would look like in an inclusive classroom. Okay, so we almost have to think of this as individualized, right? Because whenever we have behavior management or we have a behavior plan, that means that we're individualizing a plan for that student, right? Now, we're going to obviously address individualized behavior needs with assessments, targeted interventions, UDL principles, but we're really going to look at how do we foster that like inclusive classroom where we support those social emotional skills, or if there's behavior issues that go along with, say, their disability, like how do we support those families. You have your module overview and outcomes here. So we're really concentrating on looking at behavioral assessments and how they really help us identify what the problem is, right? That way you can actually guide toward targeted interventions. Well, for the purpose of our textbook, it's called Teaching in Today's Inclusive Classrooms, a Universal Design for Learning Approach. We're going to bring that in as well. So we want to bring and use those UDL principles when we're trying to explore, okay, how do we reinforce positive behaviors? How do we reduce the unwanted ones? How do we make a classroom where we all feel safe, valued, successful? What does that look like? And how do we collaborate with families in supporting them? So you'll look here, we have our course outcomes as well as your learning objectives. And remember, your learning objectives are for module 7, but they are related and are going to help us master our course outcomes. Okay, so when we're learning these next 2 weeks in this module, we're going to be able to describe the characteristics of challenging behaviors that are associated with diverse learners, and we're going to do it in measurable and observable terms. We're going to identify strategies to reinforce appropriate behaviors, reduce negative and or unproductive behaviors, and teach new behaviors using UDL principles. We're going to describe teacher-led and student-initiated mediation, explain the importance of collaboration with colleagues and parents to support the generalization of pro-social skills, and then summarize different ways to meet the behavior needs of diverse students to create positive social learning environments. So really it's a heavy subject matter. There's a lot of behavior issues in classrooms today. We're seeing more and more of it. So that's why I thought this was an appropriate time to make this a 2 week module. So aside from your overview and outcomes, obviously we have our key concepts, UDL for learning and behavior, positive behavior interventions and supports, also known as PBIS, functional behavior assessment, also known as FBA, classroom management strategies, culturally responsive behavior supports, collaboration and communication. So these are the topics that we're going to be focusing on in this 2 week module. And there's also some keywords for study that you're going to be coming across in the modules, as well as in the module, as well as your textbook and your reading. So you also have the standards. These are the standards that are connected to what you're learning. So we have our in-task. These are your teacher preparation standards, as well as the Council for Exceptional Children standards. So you can look at those on your own. So, required reading. There is a lot of reading. The chapters are short, but I just wanted to put that out there that's why remember this is a 2 week module. But you are going to read chapter 11 in your Teaching in Today's Inclusive Classrooms textbook. Okay, so this one's really going to take you through those behavior strategies. How do we incorporate UDL when we're talking about behavior and having those responsive practices? In this textbook, chapter 11, I really want you to pay close attention to PBIS, right? Those positive behavioral interventions and supports. Also, look at functional behavior assessment because this is important. That's part of the assessment piece, so we can make sure that we have guided interventions that will support the student. And then chapter 7 in A Teacher's Guide to Special Education, I gave you a link again. Hopefully you've downloaded it. It was also in your resources section in the course, but this is really going to look a little deeper and go along with what you've been learning in the teaching today's inclusive text. So it's going to talk about how do you support students with diverse needs? How do you manage their behavior, right? It also goes with that collaboration piece where we're collaborating with specialists, families, to support the students. Now, what we're also looking at here is you have your chapter 11 PowerPoints. This is only going to be for the teaching in today's inclusive classroom text. And then there's also the chapter outline. I always tell students use that. That kind of gives you just like a synopsis of what the most important things are in the PowerPoint that go along with the text. And then here I gave you a web page here that I thought was useful. So let me pull it up. So this is called manifestation determination. When you click on it, it's going to bring up this web page. Um, this is the web page called Center for Parent Information and Resources, also known as CPIRs. And what they do is it's almost like a resource for you as a teacher, but also for parents. And what it's specifically talking about is what it defines manifestation determination, right? Now, this was first introduced by IDA in the amendment that they had in 1997. But we kind of over the years simplified it, if you will, to where it makes more sense. So, what we did is when we're looking at manifestation determination, it's going to look at how we can limit the requirement to perform removals, right? So if a child, say they have a disability and there's a behavior issue that goes along with it, there is a law against removing kids from classroom and put them in an alternative school considered disciplinary procedures, right? You can't just remove them. Another thing is that when we're talking about manifestation determination, we want to know who's involved. Well, since we're talking about a student who may have disabilities, specifically, the IEP team is going to be involved, right? Um, and any kind of local education agency are also involved. Now, when we're talking about manifestation determination, if there is backlash, like if something happens and you want to remove them, you can't just do that, right? So there's got to be some review that's going to be conducted. Um, and it goes into deep detail about that. But what we want to take away from this is knowing the rights of the child. Now, sometimes it's just a behavior issue, right? It could be a learned behavior at home, um, or it could be something that's related to their disability. That's not always the case. But when it's a child who has a disability and the behavior is kind of linked together, we can't only consider that the only factor, right? So manifestation determination also is going to look at if the behavior is a result um, of the local education agency's failure to implement the IEP correctly, right? Because if you have an IEP and there's a behavior plan in there and they're not doing what they're supposed to with the IEP, then they're going to look at that. Um, so there's kind of like regulations involved in that. You can't just remove them from the classroom, especially if they have an IEP. Okay, so you're going to read more on your own. It's really interesting things about it. It talks about what to do with the child's placement, if behavior is an issue. Um, so just make sure that you check that out. I feel like it's really good behavior for you to know. Another thing I wanted to get you to look at as far as reading and resources, as I gave you a PowerPoint called Functional Behavior. I'm going to go through some of it because I feel like it's important for you to understand the underlying part of it. Um, what we say about behavior is children are going to communicate behavior. Behavior is a way that a child communicates. So whenever they're communicating, it's most of the time going to be either because they're trying to get out of something or they're trying to gain something. Okay. They may not even be aware that they're doing it, right? So they're unconsciously aware. There are different reasons for behavior, regardless of what they're communicating to you. Sometimes it could be something going on at home. It could be the way you have your room set up. It could be environmental load. any kind of sensitivities they have, or it could just be a learned response from home, right? So there's different reasons why it happens. But one thing I want to note as you're going through the material these 2 weeks and you're doing your assignments and going through the IRIS module, I want you to note that if you don't ever find the reason, like the underlying reason of what is going on, you cannot offer support. It's just not going to happen, even if you have the best intentions. So, what we do if this behavior is ongoing and ongoing, right, and it seems to worsen and nothing is working, we will have to complete what we call a functional behavior assessment. It's also known as FBA. And what it does is it goes beyond just looking at the behavior, right? We want to focus on what kinds of reasons, like are they trying to get out of something? Are they trying to gain something? Does something set them off? What's the trigger? We want to know what the function of the behavior is, also known as the purpose of the behavior. So that way the IEP team can develop a plan, right? So this chart here is interesting because it kind of breaks down when we look at behavior intervention plan. We also have to look at school-wide behavior plans. Um, if you can kind of head off some of the behaviors in the beginning, it may not have gotten to the point where you would have to have an FBA, but sometimes that just happens. But this chart is just kind of giving you a little look at how FBAs and then how we would move forward with behavior intervention plan, and also looking at what would be some positive behavior interventions and supports, which would be PBIS. And a lot of times we design these school wide, right? Because we want all students to be successful. Okay, you might have seen it in school. Be kind, be responsible, be ready. Those sorts of things would be what we would normally call like school-wide behavior systems. And then within your class, you have your own procedures and rules underneath that umbrella. Okay, so that just gives you a visual of what that is. Now, the first step is obviously in the behavior intervention is going to be figuring out what the actual behavior is. So you conduct that FBA or that functional behavior uh, assessment, like we talked about, the FBA. When you're doing this, it is only for a challenging behavior. Okay. This is not a behavior that happens sporadically or goes away. This is something that's continually. So remember, if we're defining what behavior is, it's any action which we can observe, measure. It has a distinct onset and offset. So think about that when you're going through it, right? So what happened? What was the trigger? And when did it stop? When that's how you actually define behavior. Okay. A lot of times we'll want to use the fake term. She's not being good in class. She's defiant. But really, when we're saying that, we're not really looking at what defiant is, right? The action. Some people think it's different than others. Like I would define defiance maybe a little different than you, but it has to be something that is observable, measurable, and it has a distinct onset and offset. Okay. Now, if we're looking at a behavior definition, it has to be really specific in the terms that if someone came around, they can clearly see whether that behavior is occurring or not, right? So when you say you're disrespectful, well, it's too vague. It, disrespectful, again, just like being defiant, what are you talking about? But instead of putting disrespectful, you could put, how about argues when given a direction? See, that would be more specific. You can measure that, you can observe that happening. So these are terms that are too vague, they are too broad of terms. So disruptive, off task, defiant, angry, and hostile doesn't really work. Okay. Now, the next part is really going to break down the different steps of the functional behavior assessment. Obviously, we went over the first part of it, which was identifying the problem, right? So we have to pinpoint the disciplinary problem or define that behavior, just like we practice. So, um, for instance, Marco uses inappropriate language at school. That would be an example of defining it, right? So it's simple to measure, it's simple to record. The next one, during outside play and or free time with classmates, Marco uses inappropriate language. Okay, do you see how it's very specific, right? And it's defining, it can be measured, that behavior, and it can be recorded. The next thing is you're really going to collect that data using multiple assessments, okay? Um, and one more thing about identifying the problem, step one, you have to ask yourself very important questions like, is this behavior linked to a skill deficit? Right? So, is there any evidence suggest that the student does not know how to perform the skill you're asking? Therefore, they don't do it. Or does the student understand the behavior expectations? Sometimes students don't understand. You have to physically show them and practice it, right? So, those are things to think about when you're doing it. The second one is collecting data, and there's two different ways to collect data, and you're going to be practicing it this week and putting it in next week as well in the Dropbox, which is called direct data collection, which you observe in the setting, or indirect. These are things like interviewing the parents, sending rating scales home, or to the teachers that that child sees throughout the day. Now, with indirect, this again is really relying heavily on interviews. And when you are doing a functional behavior assessment, you will have to collect both indirect data as well as direct data. Okay, so if you're doing the indirect part, you will use an interview with teachers or other adults who came in contact, also the child, and even the behavior, the parents as well. Now, when you're doing indirect assessments or you're interviewing people, these are some of the questions that you would ask, right? That would be recorded down. Now, the direct assessment is where you're going to actually observe and you're going to collect data, right? So, one of the types of direct observation data you can collect is what we call ABC. This is also known as antecedent behavior consequence, okay? And when we're doing an ABC observation, we can look at doing any of these types of recording. We could do an interval recording where we observe at specific intervals of time. We can do event recording where we're just going to tally the number of times that this event or behavior occurred, duration recording, which how long the behavior actually lasts, and then latency recording. This is the time between the trigger, which is also known as the antecedent, and the actual behavior. Okay, and they all play different roles in the kinds that we would need to look at. It's better if you do at least two, maybe even all four, depending on the situation. Now, if we're going to understand ABC, okay, antecedent, behavior, outcome, we're really going to have to look at figuring out the trigger, the antecedent. That's the most important thing, knowing what occurred right before the behavior was displayed. So it's really allowing you to predict where during the routine and when, what trigger event. Then B is the behavior. So what's the observable behavior problem? Would we give an example earlier about Marco using inappropriate language, right? And then C is the consequence. What happens immediately after the behavior occurs? So what's the consequence giving to that child? Okay, and that's known as ABC. It begins with the behavior, then you go to antecedent, like when and what happened right before the behavior, and then what was the consequence or outcome of that child's behavior. There is a video here for you. If you have it, you should be able to click on it, open it up. This is a child named Joseph where he is displaying inappropriate behavior. So you can watch his observation. You will complete an ABC form with that, but not right now. We're just going through this. So remember, when you are looking at behavior, right? The consequences matter as much as figuring out the trigger because consequences that you give that child either can increase or decrease the probability that behavior is going to occur again in the future. Okay, so these things mostly to look at. Now, I will explain about this in a minute, but I wanted to go over the most important parts that you will have to do and be looking at in this specific module. So after that PowerPoint, you have an IRIS module. This is one you are actually going to have to complete the assessment part. So whenever you get into the IRIS module right here, when you're done, there's always an assessment piece. And an assessment will have 7 questions, sometimes 4 questions. So you're going to complete all of these questions, copy and paste them on a Word document, and you will be submitting them into the Dropbox, okay? Because it tells you. A lot of them I've not been having you submit them, but this time I do want you to. You could put it in Word or a PDF and submit it to the Dropbox that says FBA, I believe. So that's one of your assignments. Your another assignment that you're going to be doing is going to be your iris case study. So if you remember on this PowerPoint, I said you're going to watch a video that will help you figure out behavior. So what you're going to do is you're going to click on iris case study, and you're going to see there's several steps here. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to read the iris case study center measuring behavior. Now, if you look back at the PowerPoint, we talked about the different types of direct data that you would get. Remember, your indirect will be like the interviews or rating scales. Your direct data will be either frequency or event recording, interval recording, duration recording, and latency. So read through this, and I would even say you need to download and save it because this is a good reference or resource for you for later. But you're going to read through it. Specifically, I want you to focus on um, the event recording because I want you to have some practice with that. Remember, it's just going to make a mark each time the behavior occurs. And if you look here, I gave you an example in here. You put the date and it uses a table like this. And how you get it is you say the time that you started observing. So remember, this is direct observation, direct recording. And you are going to say the time out. So this person started at 8:30 and then they stopped it at 8:45. So they were in there observing for 15 minutes, that child's behavior. They'll put the time that they were there. Then you do the tally. Each time the behavior occurs, you do a tally. Okay. And each one of these that has it kind of looks like two H's together, that's five because you count one, two, three, four, and then the fifth one makes like a little pack. Okay, so obviously that's 5, 10, 15, 18 times. So in 15 minutes, okay, so there was 18 occurrences. So you have to do what we call calculation rate. And how you do this is you take the total number of tallies, which were 18, and divide it by how many minutes you were in there observing the child, which was 15 minutes. That's going to give you a rate of events. So you've got 1.2, so every 1.2 minutes that child is displaying that behavior. That's a problem, right? So I said when you're on this, I want you to watch him and practice with him. So take the event recording sheet and then you can practice the behaviors that you see that little Cameron is displaying. Okay, and you would follow it just like this on page 10. Okay, so that's where I'd want you to practice that. Now, the other thing that you have here is it says to watch this iris video. So here's a second chance for you to practice. We've practiced with Cameron, and now I want you to practice with this. So this is a little girl here. There is an event recording form that you're going to click on and download it. And they're going to do the same thing. You're going to practice with her. Now, this is a short clip. It's only for illustrative purposes. So this would not be enough data for us to do a behavior intervention plan. Okay. You would just see this. And anytime you're collecting data, whether it's frequency, interval recording, it doesn't matter. You got to make sure that you think about these kinds of questions, right? And it's going to help you. So you're going to do that. Watch the video, use the event recording form. Okay, you have to see it looks exactly like what we did in this section here. Let me get back to it. Right here on page 10. Okay. And then you have the practice data sheet. If you click on it, this is what you could use. I think it's better to use this one instead of the one I just showed you. I would probably just use this one on the little girl. So what you'll do is the same thing. What time did you start, end it, tally, observation, and what was the rate? Now down here is something new. Remember, this is practice, okay? I will give you feedback on it, but I really want you to go through the PowerPoint. I want you to go through the chapter. I really want you to look at the IRIS case study paper I gave you because I feel like it's going to help break it down a little bit easier for you. Okay, so when I'm talking about um, this, I want you to look at it and practice. But what you're doing with this form is you are going to get the frequency of her behavior as well as the interval recording. Now, we talked about frequency where you're doing how many times it happens. Now we're going to look at interval. This is a little bit different, okay? We want to see um, the time that it occurred, right? Like interval, seconds, mostly what we're looking at. So if a child has a behavior, you would put a plus sign, right? So when you're watching the video, anytime a bad behavior that's unwanted would happen, you'd put a plus, then you do behavior. And intervals means you do it in a short amount of time. So for you, I chose 20 seconds. You could really look at 15 seconds or 30 seconds. It's up to you. Normally 20 is pretty good. So as you're watching the video, I know it's 5 minutes and maybe 20 seconds long, but we only want to look at every 20 seconds. So if the behavior occurs that's unwanted, you'd put a plus and you'd write what the behavior is. Now remember, it needs to be measurable. You can't put she's being bad or defined. You have to actually be specific in what's happening. If it doesn't happen, you just put a minus sign, right? That means it didn't occur in that 20 seconds. And then when you're done, you're going to add up how many um, intervals you counted, right? So for the behavior occurred, we're talking about the unwanted behavior. And then the total, how many you collected. So we have 8 here. So whatever that is divided by 8 is going to give you your percentage. Okay, so that will break it down a little bit further than just event. Remember, in every 20 seconds, how often is this behavior occurring? That's the rate we're looking for. I did have an example here for you that I feel like would be helpful. Um, it shows you kind of how someone started doing it. They put they started observing at 10:30, then they stopped at 10:32. Within that 2 minutes and 30 seconds, six behaviors that were unwanted occurred. Um, the length of ever is 5 minutes, but I don't I don't think you need to put 5 minutes. I would just put 2 minutes. Okay. And then you get your rate. And then again, you'll see an example of every 20 seconds what was happening. The plus means there was a behavior, the minus, okay, so this is giving you an example of how you would do it. Okay, so every time it occurred, plus what happened. The students complaining about the repetition of their work assignments, minus, plus, things like that. So that's what you will turn in for your activities. Okay, so you have two things to turn in. You will do this IRIS case study recording. Remember, this is practice. This one I will take a grade on. Um, this one I do want you to turn it in because I want you to have that practice of using direct observation. Now, I didn't give you indirect like a rating scale or interview, but I did want you to see that and practice the direct observation data. So then you would look at doing your Module 7 quiz, and you'll see here that it ends on November 2nd. And then this is going to be due on the 15th. Okay? Actually, I might make them both due on the, so that date might change, but I'll email you if it does. But all right, you have until that time to get your stuff done. Don't forget what I talked about for your referral confirmation. Also, don't forget about your um, choice-based project of the interview or the peer review articles also due. So please keep that in mind. All right, I know that was a long video and it's a lot of information, but again, I felt like it's necessary to break down the most highlighted parts of this to go along with your assignments. I hope that you have a great day and a great couple weeks, and I will see you soon. Bye.